Now then, Buddhism. In order to introduce Buddhism, it's necessary to remember...
This is Infants on Thrones, the philosophies of men mingled with humor. We are the core.
Welcome back to Infants on Thrones. I'm Glenn Osland, and this is part 2, the final part of my conversation with Noah Rasheta on his book, No Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners. So let's just pick up right where we left off in part 1.
Again, using the analogy of the clay Buddha, the clay is the conditioning, the idea or the belief that has me blinded from experiencing contentment, because here I am comparing how I am to how I think I should be, and the whole idea of how I should be could just be a conceptual truth that I've inherited from words and from society, and there's really nothing else to it other than, well, I believe that I should be this way, so until I'm this way, I'm not happy. Here I am sitting miserably because I'm not mindful enough, or I'm not kind enough, or I'm not whatever it is, that there's no truth to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And you talk about suffering and unhappiness and trauma a lot. And this is something that maybe you can help me understand better, because I hear people when they talk about Buddhism, they'll say that, one of the main purpose of Buddhism is to remove suffering from the world, or to eliminate suffering. And, as I've looked into it, I don't think that that's exactly right. I don't think that's even possible. So I've got some thoughts on that, but I want to hear what you have to say first about the role of suffering in Buddhism.
I do think that is one of the misconceptions. And like you said, it's not possible. The first, so if you were to take Buddhism and kind of present it as, here are the universal truths that are taught in Buddhism, the first one of those, the first of the noble truths, is that in life there is suffering. Mm-hmm. Now, some people will misinterpret that and say life is suffering.
Anyone who says differently is selling something.
And that's not what it's saying. What it's trying to be conveyed in that teaching is that in life we all experience difficulties. The moment I want life to be other than it is, I get this feeling, which is what we call suffering. Or discontent or anguish. There's so many words that could be used in place of suffering. But it's that feeling of life isn't going the way that I want it to go. And that feeling of that disconnect, that's suffering. Recognizing that that's universal. Everyone's going to experience it. What Buddhism is trying to do is essentially weed out what is natural suffering and what is self-inflicted suffering. An example of natural suffering is like stubbing your toe, or the feeling that you get when you put a lot of hard work into something and then you buy something and then that thing breaks, right? That natural feeling of loss, or the loss of a loved one would be another good example of a very natural form of suffering, which is, that's not what we're concerned with in Buddhism. That's not the type of suffering that we're looking to eliminate. What we're concerned with in this practice is recognizing that a lot of the suffering we experience is suffering that we bring on ourselves because of ideas or beliefs. And what we're trying to do is recognize the self-inflicted suffering that I experience in life. That is something I can work with. That has causes. What are the causes of that suffering? It may just be something as simple as a belief that I hold, and that belief creates this unnecessary suffering. That's something I can work with and eliminate. So we're looking to eliminate the forms of self-inflicted suffering in life, but it's a misconception to say we're trying to eliminate suffering. That goes against the very first of those truths, which is that in life there difficulties arise, or there is suffering. So trying to get rid of it, like I mentioned for me in my story and in my book, that only made it worse, because you can't get rid of some of this stuff. That's the experience of being alive, is also the experience of discontent and heartache and anger and pain, along with all the good things, joy and happiness and laughing. It's kind of taking all of it and recognizing where can I weed out and discover the self-inflicted part of this.
Do you ever talk to people and get pushback where, for example, you might take something like the Me Too movement and, Harvey Weinstein and patriarchy and rape and all these awful, horrible things that happen, that the awareness has really, really increased, that these things are going on. And so you're saying, well, Buddhism isn't really about eliminating the source of suffering. And so people would go, oh, well, wait, so you're okay with rape? You're okay with all of these horrible things? Buddhism is okay with that? No, we've got to change this. We've really got to change. Do you ever come across that kind of pushback?
I only a couple of times. I think so. We have this tendency to view life through the dichotomy of this or that, black and white, right and wrong. And an example of this, early on in my marriage, I realized how natural it is to draw the counter assumption to something. So at a Sunday dinner, I said, I can't remember what the food was, but let's say I said, hey, this corn was really good. And the person who had made the rice said, oh, you didn't like the rice? and I realized early on, okay, that's drawing to a conclusion that isn't there. To say the corn is good is not to say the same as saying the rice is bad. And I think that's important to clarify when we're talking about these concepts in Buddhism. To say I'm trying to eliminate unnecessary suffering, or I'm trying to eliminate self-inflicted suffering, is not the same as saying, then I will accept every other form of suffering. It's not the same thing. What Buddhism is striving to do as an introspective process, as a philosophical way of life, or for some people as a religious practice, is to identify moments of self-inflicted suffering that I can do something about and remove those. It would absolutely also entail recognizing instances of natural suffering that have causes and conditions that you can work with. For example, I'm in an abusive relationship. There's a significant amount of natural suffering going on, but there are causes there. Staying in the relationship is one of the causes of that suffering. So I can skillfully approach that form of suffering and say, okay, I'm going to get out of this relationship. Or like the Me Too movement, we identify all of these causes and conditions that are leading to this. So we say, let's do something about it and change our cultural views or our approach or whatever needs to be changed. I think that falls into it, absolutely falls into it. But that's not the core of the practice. The core of the practice is it's an introspective one where you are dealing with you. But that doesn't mean that at any moment you should not care about all the things that are not you.
Sure, right. So in the corn and rice example, is the source of suffering for the person who says, oh, what, you didn't like my rice? That's an example of self-inflicted suffering?
Absolutely, because there's meaning being made there that's not real.
So you as a Buddhist or secular Buddhist would you apologize then and try to clarify and go, oh no, I didn't mean that, or would you just allow them to simmer in their own delusions?
I don't know that there's a position that I could say this is the secular Buddhist part of you. My personal approach would be to clarify and say, oh, I didn't mean that. I enjoyed the rice, but I've never had corn quite like that corn. Or, something to kind of emphasize, no, it's not that I didn't like everything else. It's that specific thing to me stood out.
And I guess what I'm trying to get to in that is that for you to then not become a source of self-suffering, because you could easily feel guilty then that, oh, I unintentionally hurt this person who made the rice. And I don't want to hurt, I want to make them feel better. So you start like overdoing it a little bit.
Yeah. That's a very real thing because, then I could say, oh no, I actually really did like the rice. And now a third family member saying, oh, you didn't like the salad then.
Yeah. and then you're scrambling to like be somebody, and maybe you actually didn't really like the rice as much. You really did like the corn, but you don't want to hurt that person's feelings, and so then you're being a little bit dishonest with yourself, dishonest with them as a way to try and smooth things over. I could see that as potentially being a source of self-suffering as well, because you're creating some incongruity in yourself. And I don't know what to do.
Well, here's another way to approach this. What I noticed in my family dynamics because of this, I found myself not complimenting the thing I really liked anymore. It was easy just to say, hey, thank you everyone for the dinner. It was great. And not highlight, hey, thank you so-and-so for that one, the bread that you baked. Wow, that was really good. That's also it's made me think, well, is that doing a disservice? Now I don't find myself complimenting the one person for fear of offending all the ones who aren't getting complimented.
Right.
That's worth thinking about too.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
And I don't know that there are any answers to that. It's just one of those, an additional conundrum that we encounter in life. If I become very vocal about one specific movement that's happening that hits home for me, is someone else going to say, oh, you're vocal about that, but you're not vocal about this other injustice in the world? Does that mean you don't care about that? I think we would encounter those same issues. And those of us who are vocal about one cause, we're not vocal about all the causes. We're not out there with signs picketing this other big injustice happening somewhere else, because we just can't. So does that put us in this camp where, okay, well, I try to be conscious of all the injustices and do what I can, when I can, where I can with all of them. Again, how you approach it, well, is there a right way? I don't know. There's your way and there's my way. And I think that's important to keep in mind, allowing people to, you do what you do. It's great. You're doing that, and it's creating this voice, and it's creating all this awareness. I may not be there holding the sign on that specific issue, but maybe I'm over here doing what I can on this other thing, and not accuse each other of, well, you're not doing enough, Yeah.
That I think that's a tough one for me, because I don't ever want to be the source of suffering for somebody else, but being able to recognize, where do I draw the line between who's responsible for the cause of that suffering in that corn and rice situation? Is it really me that did it? Or is it the other person that did it? And then what's the kind charitable response? Is it to do what the Prince Buddha's dad did and try to shelter him from all of the suffering in the world that only makes suffering when it happens more acute? Or is it to let them sit with it and figure out how to not be offended on their own and still just love them through it? I don't know. Okay. So I want to go back. The first noble truth is that there is suffering in this world. And you made the distinction that it's not that life is suffering, because that implies that the entirety of life is just filled with suffering that fills the immensity of everything that is life. And that's not what it's saying. It's saying that in the course of life, there will be suffering. That is a fundamental experience in life. It's not the only one. There are other things, but suffering is a part of it. Mm-hmm. And then the second noble truth has to do with desire. And I think that one gets misrepresented a lot as well, that desire is the source of suffering, is the way that I first learned it and thought about it for so many years. And then more recently, as I've been listening to stuff with Alan Watts, I go, oh no, I don't think that's really what it's saying. So tell me, what is the second noble truth about desire?
Yeah, it's maybe if you were to scale it back a bit more, it's not necessarily that a desire is the source of it. What it's trying to get at is the understanding that there are causes to suffering. Suffering has causes and conditions. Now, this puts us in a position where we can say, okay, well, if suffering has causes and conditions, but I can't get rid of suffering, I may be able to work with the causes and conditions. In those causes and conditions, there may be things that I can work with. Desire is one of those. So a common teaching in Buddhism is that we have this tendency of desire towards the things that we like, that feel good, and aversion towards the things that we don't like, the things that don't feel good. And they're two sides of the same coin. So I find myself in this situation where I have aversion towards anger, for example, going back to the example I was giving you early.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing anger and now I'm angry about the anger. That is an example of aversion. Desire could be, oh, I like how it feels to be when I experience something pleasant. So now I'm chasing after that. And this could be, desire could be the very thing that leads to like addictions, for example, because I'm chasing after that feeling that I like. So what Buddhism is saying is, when I understand that about myself, that there are natural desires and there are natural aversions, what if I can become more comfortable with the discomfort of not having all my desires and not running away from all the aversions? There can be more equanimity, and that will eliminate a lot of the causes of my suffering. The misconception again is, oh, I'm not supposed to desire anything. But there's a problem in thinking that, because if I desire to not desire, I'm desiring.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck. So this is again one of those moments where you just try to recognize the nature of how things are, and to recognize, well, this is the nature of how things are. I desire after what's pleasant, and I have aversion towards the unpleasant. Just knowing that about myself will allow me to be more skillful with my desires and with my aversions. Why am I really running from that? Why does that feel bad? Why do I not want to feel this feeling? Or the flip side, right? Here's this thing I'm chasing after. Oh, well, why do I want that? Because, and you just keep digging and digging and digging. And what you end up with is a little bit more wisdom about yourself. And the whole point of that is that understanding that suffering has causes and conditions allows me to handle the suffering I experience in life with a little bit more skill. And that's really the end game. Again, it's not like, oh, I'm going to eliminate all my suffering. Now I'll never desire and I'll never have aversion. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is you can develop more skill around the desires and the aversions that you have in life.
Yeah. I think the way that I've come to think of it more recently is that the desire for things to be other than what they are only increases suffering. Mm-hmm. Because you've put yourself on this impossible quest. And so there's a level of acceptance, I think, in just desiring for things to be as they are. And if that the causes and conditions of suffering, that you recognize these and then you accept that they are, and you might want them to be other than what they are, but it's kind of a futile effort in some cases. But you have to be able to parse out what are the things that you actually can change and what are the things that you can't. And so it's a struggle. Is that just my own kind of bastardized interpretation of that second noble truth? Or in asking the question, you're going to ask me to bring you the right rock before you give me the right answer?
No, I think that is a common, deeper understanding of that truth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the third one, if I'm remembering right, the third noble truth is nirvana. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of depends how they're framed in different traditions. They kind of come across differently. The third one is about understanding that there is a way to work with the causes and conditions. And then the fourth one is about the path. What is the path that leads to that?
Is that the middle way path, the eightfold path of the middle way?
Yeah.
Okay.
So with the third one, you're kind of just understanding, it's like the sense of hope. Oh, I can do something about the things that I can do something about. I can't do something about the things that I can't do something about. So again, it kind of goes into the parsing of having that wisdom to know this is something I can work with. This is something I can't work with. And what that instills right away is this like a wisdom of adaptability. If I can't do anything about it, okay, then I can accept that this is how this is and move on to what can I work with. So you're exploring this in yourself a lot with this concept of the third one. Example.
Go ahead.
What's that?
Yeah, give the example.
An example that I would give is, I just realized as I'm about to give this example, I always give the example of the emotion of anger. And I think that's because for me, I kind of grew up with this notion that you're not supposed to be angry. You're a nice guy.
Right.
You always turn the other cheek. And the more that I've been told that that's a characteristic that I have, the more angry I get when I do have anger.
Yeah.
So, recognizing that about myself and working with Buddhism as a philosophical way of trying to live, I detect, like, when I get home and if I step on a Lego and suddenly I'm feeling anger, what has changed for me isn't that I don't get angry. It's that when I do get angry, I recognize it right away as, oh, here's this emotion again. I think about it and there it is. Why am I experiencing this? And I can remain more neutral with the experience of being angry and not have the intense aversion to the anger that was a part of my life for so many years. So I'll sit there and I'll be angry for a while, and I'm not angry that I'm angry. It's just I'm just angry, and I'll experience wanting to pick up the Legos, wanting to throw them away, and say no more Legos in the house. Like, all of these thoughts pop into my head while I'm angry, and it's almost comical how it'll shift to this moment of smiling at my anger and recognizing there it is again.
Yeah.
That thing that I've avoided for so long in my life, it pops up every now and then, and here it is right now. I'm experiencing it, and I almost have compassion for the me that's feeling the emotion, and it's changed the relationship that I have with the emotion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what we're after with that, with the third noble truth. It's recognizing, there's suffering, and suffering has causes and conditions, but the relationship we have with this whole thing, there's flexibility there.
This is just like teaching everybody how to be a Jedi, right?
I'm ending all of this. The tree, the text, the Jedi. I'm going to burn it down.
Just like very Zen.
It's
like
fun
observing your emotions. Yeah.
Fear leads to the dark side.
Right. All of that. Yeah. I think the way that I understood the third one as nirvana, I'm going back to when I was first introduced to Buddhism in the mid 90s in that BYU world history class. And the concept that I had at the time of nirvana was of like, that's the state of no wind. I think that's literally what it means. And that was the afterlife concept in Buddhism, that instead of like going to heaven or the celestial kingdom or degrees of glory or anything like that, what you really want to attain to in Buddhism is this afterlife sense of nirvana. So more recently, what I've come to think of is that it's not a super, or it doesn't have to be, maybe some traditions interpret it that way, but that it could also be interpreted in a non-supernatural way, that the state of no wind is actually like you breathe in, you take a breath, and then you breathe out. And that breathing out, that exhaling is letting go. That's the no wind. That's so almost like, from your example of being angry about being angry, you're letting go of your own anger about being angry, and you're just letting that emotion that you're feeling manifest itself. You're observing that, you're recognizing the causes and impacts. You're seeing how it ripples throughout your body and the different things it's making you want to do. And then you're able to become more compassionate towards yourself because you see that. But it's like just kind of like letting go and letting things be what they are instead of, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and like racking yourself up with guilt. You're like, so how was that?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So nirvana is often translated as extinguishing. And what's being extinguished is, according to some traditions, it's like the fires of hatred and delusion and craving. So again, we go back to the desire and the aversion. And what gets extinguished is wanting things to be other than how they are. Mm-hmm. So I think the misconception with nirvana as an ultimate destination in most Buddhist traditions, you'll hear a lot about the concept of heaven and hell as being present state moments, mental states, not places you go to, but it's what you're experiencing now in the present moment. If you correlate that with this concept of nirvana is more of a state of peace, not an actual place, but it's a mental state. And if you're correlating this with the definition that extinguishing, it's like recognizing that nirvana doesn't mean I won't experience anger. It means I'll be content with the anger I'm experiencing. I'm at peace with whatever is. And if what is right now is anger, and I'm at peace with that, then there's nirvana. And again, when we define it, this is where it becomes problematic, because if someone says, oh, nirvana is this peaceful state where you no longer have anger or you're always at peace, well, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to me? What does it mean to someone else who hears it? We start getting all these different concepts of it. But if at its root, peace is acceptance. Peace is being content with things just as they are. And sometimes things are that I'm hungry. Sometimes things are that I'm angry. Sometimes the current state is just I'm sad. And when I'm okay with accepting that current state as it is, I'm at peace. And then it's like, oh, well, that's nirvana. That's the extinguishing of wanting things to be other than they are. You're just accepting things for that moment as they are, while recognizing that change is inevitable, right? Change is the constant. So it's not to say I'm going to accept things as they are and never strive to change my life or change these injustices in the world. It's not that, because change is inevitable. But what it is it's giving me the ability to approach these changes with more skill. I can be more skillful about it because I'm not being driven by greed or hatred or delusion. I've accepted that this is how it is. I'm angry. And what am I going to do with that anger? I'm going to take action. And I think Martin Luther King's a good example of this. You know, he fought against injustices that were taking place in his day. And there were, I think it's safe to say that there was probably anger involved with that.
Sure.
There were a lot of emotions involved with that, but hatred didn't seem to be one of those. He was coming from a place of much more skillful action.
Yeah.
And that's what Buddhism is trying to do. It's trying to help us be in this place where we can have more skillful action and less unskillful reactivity, where I'm just reacting to the emotions I'm experiencing and reacting to whatever life is throwing at me. That's not very skillful. And that's kind of what this boils down to me, at least, in my opinion. That's the ultimate aim of all of this as a practice.
Yeah. No, I like invoking Martin Luther King. I think his letters from Birmingham jail had such an impact on me. Again, this is going back, to when I was in college and read it for the first time. And it does seem like a very responsible, healthy way to deal with injustice and fight against injustice without kind of giving in to those things that would make it worse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how are you doing on time, by the way?
I'm good.
Okay. With the fourth noble truth, which is the middle way, eightfold path. This is one that for me is always very blurry compared to the first three. Can you sum it up? Like what is the value in the fourth one, or what are the key things to remember about that fourth noble truth?
Yeah, I think if you were to summarize it, that's probably the more skillful way of doing it, rather than saying, here's number one, here's number two. It's what it's trying to get at is that there is a path that we can, a way that we can approach life that's going to result in less self-inflicted suffering for ourselves and others. And that pertains to the practical things in life. What kind of a job do I have? What kind of communication do I have with the people that I communicate with? What kind of effort goes into me into my spiritual practice of trying to be more mindful. It's essentially the different aspects of your life where you can make a difference. And some of them are obvious, like, well, if I were to go get a job as an assassin, well, I'm going to create a lot more suffering than if I get a job as a doctor, right? So that could be an aspect of the path, is the type of work that you do.
I could put an assassin to some pretty good use, though, that would eliminate suffering, I think, right now. But maybe I shouldn't think that way.
But so you get the gist of what's trying to be communicated with the fourth truth is, what are the areas in your life where you can actually start looking at them and being pragmatic in your approach to, is this causing me more suffering? And is it causing others more suffering? And that's really the intent of the fourth noble truth, is what is that path? What is the lifestyle that I can live that minimizes the self-inflicted suffering that I put on me and others?
All right. I like that. Yeah. And that's always one I feel like I need to spend more time in, that like really trying to internalize what that path is. I think that's probably the next step for me in learning more about Buddhism.
I think when the path or the fourth noble truth is approached as okay, what are the rules here? What can I do? What can't I do? What do Buddhists do and not do? I don't think that's very beneficial,
right?
Because it doesn't really work that way. It's recognizing, there's this other concept in Buddhism that this is skillful means. And it's the recognition that what is skillful means for you in your life and in your circumstances may be different than what is skillful means for me in my life and in my circumstances. So if I approach this concept of the path as a list, like I would the commandments, right? Do this, don't do that. Well, there may be things that make more sense for you to do and for me not to do based on our circumstances. So, I wanted to emphasize that, because I think when we look at any of the things that emerge as part of this path, any books that are going to talk about it, rather than thinking of it as these fixed sets of rules
that apply in every situation to every single person.
They're more like guidelines to look at that I can apply to my life and decide, is this skillful for me to do this or not?
Like parlay.
The code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
Yeah, exactly.
More like guidelines.
It's exactly what came to my mind.
Yeah. So, and that kind of leads into this discussion about dogma, because when you mention in your book that Buddhism doesn't have dogma, or tries not to have dogma, but it seems that it's just human nature that gravitates towards dogma, that would take the Four Noble Truths, that would take the Eightfold Path and turn it into dogma. And maybe that's a reaction, again, the falling with the parachute, and give me something I can hold on to, that's certainty, and a checklist that I can do to know that I'm doing it the right way. But do all of the different that is a broad question. Do the different sects of Buddhism do an equally good job of eschewing dogma, or does dogma creep in even to different Buddhists that say we don't want dogma, but then they end up dogmatic in certain ways?
Yeah, I think it's wishful thinking to think there's no dogma in the schools of Buddhism. I think there's a lot of dogma, and even the.
And how would you define dogma?
Rigidity.
Okay.
This is the right way to view this. This is the right interpretation of that. This is the right way to be, what to do, what not to do. Any form of, I guess, kind of an incontrovertible truth.
And then I think especially the inverse of that. If this is the right way, then that's the wrong way.
Yeah.
Well, you're doing it the wrong way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, you even find it with the non-dogmatic approaches, because they're like, like secular Buddhism. You'll find secular Buddhists who will be dogmatic against the dogmatism of classical Buddhists and say, well, they're doing it all wrong because they're too dogmatic. And it's like, well, now here you are doing the very same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it creeps in everywhere. I think that's the natural human tendency to want definitions and lines and labels and in groups and out groups. And in all of that, dogmatism absolutely creeps in.
So what do you do when you encounter dogma? And I want to take that into two pieces. When you encounter it in yourself, and you recognize that in yourself, and then what do you do when you recognize that in others?
So starting with myself, I recognize that my way of viewing things is my way. And I try to emphasize when I'm explaining to someone, whether it's talking about Buddhism or talking about some life lesson with my kids, I try to end it with, this is how I view it. Or if I'm talking about Buddhism, I always say, in my opinion, what's trying to be conveyed here is blah, blah, blah. I try to emphasize the notion that this is just how I view it. You may view it very differently, and yours may be more accurate for you in your life to understand it that way than I understand it in my way. I don't know that it's possible to ever completely eliminate dogmatism. It's like saying I'm trying to eliminate all my biases.
Right.
Well, the nature of being human and having a brain is that you will have biases. Mm-hmm. So I think it's helpful just to recognize that creeps in. That's a very natural thing. So how do I work with that skillfully? Mm-hmm. That's how I work with it with myself. What was the other area you wanted?
When you encounter it in others.
Oh,
someone's responding to you very dogmatically.
Yeah, that one's a lot more tricky because it's not helpful or skillful to say, "Oh, you're being dogmatic." So, how do you get someone else to see their dogmatic approach? I don't know. What I usually do is I say, "Oh, that must make sense for you. It doesn't make sense like that for me." But I bet if I were you, I bet I would see it exactly like that. That's usually the extent I'll go. I don't try to break down someone's dogma or highlight the errors in their thinking. I don't think that's very beneficial in most circumstances. Maybe I would in certain instances, like family dynamics, where if my spouse and I are approaching a topic and it's affecting the way our kids are going to grow up, yeah, that might be more important to say, well, wait a second, we need to approach how you're viewing this and how I'm viewing this, and I'll spend more time there dissecting a dogmatic thought or a dogmatic belief. But in my everyday interactions with people, I don't even worry about it. They can be dogmatic.
Okay. You give a parable in your book that's called the poisoned arrow. Mm-hmm. Can you tell that story here and explain how that story relates to what we've been talking about?
Sure. There are two parables of poisoned arrows. Are you referring to the one that illustrates the second arrow, or the one that's the poison arrow and looking for
a cure?
Okay.
Yeah.
That one I think highlights the pragmatic approach to Buddhism, and it's conveyed in this parable of a poisoned arrow. So the story is that there's someone walking out in the field or in the forest, and out of the blue they get shot by someone with a poisoned arrow. And there they are looking at the arrow, maybe protruding from their chest or wherever they got hit. And they assemble their entourage, all their people, to go out and find who did this, what kind of bow did they use, what kind of string was on the bow, what kind of wood was the arrow crafted from, and what kind of bird did the feather come from, all these details. And
what kind of an injustice it was that they even got shot by an arrow in the first place. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
They didn't deserve it.
So they all go out there looking, and when they come back, the person's there dead. Yeah. And so the origin, the background of this story, this is a parable that the Buddha taught, and he was approached on several instances by his own disciples with concern about addressing some of the bigger existential questions in life. Some of the questions of their time was, is life a finite thing, or is it infinite? Questions like that, wanting to know the nature of reality. And he was very careful to never get into the answers of the existential questions. They seemed irrelevant to him. And this was the parable he gave. So at one point, one of his disciples was so fed up. He's like, I need to know the answers to some of these questions. If you don't tell me, I'm just going to leave the order. I'm going to leave the monastic order. And that's where the Buddha says, well, let me tell you the story. And he gives the parable of the arrow. And at the end, he says, well, they all came back and they didn't have answers to the questions, and the guy was dead anyway. And so that's where he flips it. And he's like, that's kind of like us in life. It's like we've been hit with this poisoned arrow that guarantees that at some point we're all going to die. That's the inevitable truth to the situation at hand. So yeah, you could send everyone out and try to answer all these unanswerable questions, or you could be more skillful and tend to the actual situation at hand, which is, I have limited time left now. What am I going to do with that time? Am I going to tend to the wound that I'm experiencing and try to make the time I have left more enjoyable? Those are things that ultimately are more skillful than the seeking the answers to all these unanswerable questions. So I think knowing the context of where that parable emerges is important, because that a lot of us are like the person shot with the arrow, and then we're directing all the questions to the wrong places. Maybe it's not fair to say the wrong places, but less skillful places. Because how do you know all these things? You can't know all the details of that arrow. You don't have enough time to go find all this out. So it's more skillful to say, well, here's the situation at hand. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to do with this? And that's something I really like about Buddhism. It's putting the emphasis on the situation at hand. In life, difficulties arise. Well, what am I going to do with that? I'm going to have aversion towards the unpleasant ones. I'm going to feel desire or craving towards the pleasant things. Well, what am I going to do with that? How do I navigate that skillfully? And just taking a more pragmatic approach to the situation at hand. That's what I really enjoy about Buddhism as a philosophy, as a way of life, or as a religious practice, like some people would practice it. It's very pragmatic in its nature.
Cool. Yeah, I really liked that story when I came across it in the book, because what I took away from it was that in this limited time, as you're dying with the poison, you're focusing on the wrong things. Mm-hmm. It's not going to cure you of the poison. It's not going to improve your condition as you're. It's just, but how common is that we do respond to any kind of injury that we perceive from other people by wanting to be vengeful or find retribution, or all of these different things that we could go off as distractions from really what we should be focusing on. And I like that in that story. So let's talk a little bit about your podcast, because you started this, what was it, December 2015, Secular Buddhism? And why do you make the emphasis on secular Buddhism? Why is that the qualifier, the descriptor?
Yeah, it's so Buddhism in itself is it's a non-theistic tradition. It's already very secular as it is, but most people don't know that. I didn't know that. And my initial contact with Buddhism was a very, I'll put my feet in the water and feel it out before I really dive into it, because I was coming from a place where I had zero interest in any new form of ism in my life. And Buddhism sounded just like any other ism. So when I realized just how pragmatic it can be and non-religious it can be, when I would talk about it with other people, I noticed, at least the circles that I run in, which is a lot of people who are disaffected with religion, were leery. They didn't want another religion. But when I told them Buddhism is very secular in its nature, or I'd say secular Buddhism, the defenses were down. It's like, oh, I'm interested in that. If it's a non-religious explanation of Buddhism or Buddhism as a philosophy, then they're interested in hearing about it.
So secular is the Trojan horse that you put Buddhism inside to just spring religion on them eventually, right? They think they're not getting religion, but you're really giving them religion. I'm kidding.
No, the way it worked for me was this understanding that Buddhism is just Buddhism. There's really no such thing as secular Buddhism, but secular Buddhism is it's viewing Buddhism through a secular lens. How does this stuff make sense outside of the context of religion? And what I found is, well, it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, it's just a view of Buddhism as a philosophy or as a way of life. But I don't necessarily view secular Buddhism as a separate form of Buddhism as opposed to regular Buddhism. Buddhism is just Buddhism. It's all these collections of teachings and perspectives and ideas and stories. And some people will explain those things to you in a very religious context, like, oh, let's go light candles and sing chants about it. Others will explain a lot of these same perspectives and stories to you in a very pragmatic approach, like I do. And that's why I call it secular Buddhism.
I remember it was probably a year and a half ago. I was in a car with your brother Nick and Anessa, and you had already started your podcast and had been for a while. And he was telling me how successful you were, and I don't remember the downloads. So I'm interested to know what your downloads are. But I remember thinking, yeah, this is a topic that has a much broader appeal than ex-Mormonism that we focus on for Infants on Thrones. So I'm curious what the response has been from listeners and what kind of an impact you feel like you've made with it.
It's been growing quite a bit. I'm approaching 2.5 million downloads and hundreds of thousands of regular listeners now. And what I found, what seems to be pretty universal, is it's an audience that at some point has become disaffected with their inherited beliefs, or their faith tradition, and they've dabbled with Buddhism a little bit, and then when they see the prefix secular to Buddhism, then it piques their interest because they feel like, what is this non-religious Buddhism he's talking about? And then they dive into it and start learning about these concepts and realize, there's nothing you don't need to fear what's being taught in Buddhism because it's not trying to convert anyone to anything. Yeah. And you get the same sentiment in classical Buddhism. Even the Dalai Lama, says, do not try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist. Use it to be a better whatever you already are. It's like, it's already fascinating that Buddhists will tell you, why on earth would you want to be a Buddhist? There's nothing special about it. Just be what you are, be a better whatever you already are. And I think secular Buddhism is just another approach to that says you can study this just from a simply pragmatic perspective of how can this make me be a better whatever I already am. I think that's just an important part to highlight here. It's not that this approach is better than any other approach of teaching Buddhism. What worked for one person may not work for another. Someone will encounter these teachings in a very religious way. Some will encounter it through this path. It's a very non-religious way of studying it.
Do you have a lot of interaction with your listeners? Do they email you, get in touch with you in other ways? Do you do interviews with listeners?
I do interact a lot with listeners, mostly by email. People will thank me for taking the time to share this or that concept or explain how it benefited them. I haven't ever interviewed listeners on the podcast, but I have been told on multiple occasions, I found your podcast. I wasn't really interested in Buddhism, but the word secular stuck out to me. And most of the people who listen to it, like I said, are disaffected from some religion or another. Yeah. And they were wanting something. Just a strictly atheist approach to life wasn't quite working. They wanted some kind of an explanation of something. And, they often encounter Buddhism in the form of a quote somewhere, and they're like, oh, that's a neat way of thinking. So they want to study it a little bit more.
They look it up and they find your podcast. And, Yeah, that's cool. So on average, it looks like you release about 2 episodes per month, like every 2 weeks or so, you'll do an episode.
Yeah.
What within the first week, What kind of numbers? What's your download number?
Usually 20,000 in the first 48, 72 hours.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
At the height of Infants on Thrones, we probably had like 13,000 in a month. And like right now where we are, we're probably like 4,000 or 5,000 within the first week. Or maybe it was 13,000 within the first week. Anyway, but yeah, that's great, man. That is a great reach.
Yeah.
And a good message. Now, I did go to iTunes to look at your reviews, and I found the most negative review. And I want to read it to you, and I want you to respond to it. Have you read it? Do you go and you look at them?
I have. It's been a while, so okay. I don't know if it's the same one.
So this comment was left on June 12th, so a little over a month ago from when we're recording this, and it was a specific response to episode 74.
Oh, okay. Then I haven't heard this.
Okay, good. So we'll be doing this in real time. So he titled it "Dangerous Teachings That Remove You from the Present Moment." 1 star by questionable teacher, which I'm assuming is a man, might not be. And he says, in this episode, Noah lays out a system to test your dedication and love by playing out worst case scenario situations. And if you don't feel like you could love the person through it, you need to question yourself. This is terribly dangerous, as in many cases, we don't know how we will react until the moment arrives. Also, love and dedication on this level builds over time. You can't expect yourself to be ready to bathe and take care of someone's bowel movements when first growing a relationship. It's ludicrous. Do not use this system to evaluate your love, as you will surely come up short. This teaching is so far from Buddhist teachings, creating this false what-ifs and horrible situations. This takes you out of the present, creating anxiety over situations that have not, and in all likelihood, will not take place. Suffering is often caused by comparison, and comparing your current state to a state that is fabricated in a dedication test are surely a path to unhappiness and unnecessary anxiety for yourself and the partner who is trying to accept the now and live in it, accepting what comes with the struggles and hardships of this life. Awful, awful episode. So
wow,
what say you to that, Noah? That's the only like 1 star written negative review that you have out of the hundreds of 5-star reviews that you have on your podcast.
Yeah. Again, I'd go to what meaning was he making to whatever explanation I was giving, because I agree with what he's saying. The comparison of the present to a fabricated future is absolutely a cause of suffering.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how he understood what I was trying to convey in that concept of, comparing the various potential aspects of how the relationship could be. What I was trying to get across in that episode was that if we have a fixed idea of how a relationship should be, and we hold to that without recognizing that that's going to change, we're doing ourselves a disservice in the relationship. So the exercise or the method of thinking of other scenarios it's not a comparison of the present to those scenarios. It's just, it's another way of being introspective and recognizing, the example that comes to mind, like with our kids, I think if I just think, I love my son just the way that he is because he loves to play baseball with me out in the yard right now. But I don't have the forethought of, what if he grows up and hates baseball? Or what if my son grows up and he's gay? Or what if, all these other alternative possibilities of how they could be? What am I going to do when change does come and my son is a different person than he was when he was the 5-year-old? Like that's going to happen. So I wasn't trying to say, imagine all these alternative scenarios of the people that you love and compare the present moment to any of those future ones. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to put yourself in a position where you can recognize, would you still love everyone? Like, are you going to love your wife when she's old and wrinkly? Because if you haven't thought that one day she will be old and wrinkly, then I think you're doing yourself a tremendous disservice.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to convey in that idea. And I may have represented or said it in a way that he misunderstood what I was trying to get at.
Well, there will always be people who are upset that you didn't compliment their rice dish.
Yeah.
So maybe something like that was going on in what you said. But I'm looking at the time. I'm realizing we've been talking almost for 2 hours now, and we really haven't brought up the idea of attachment. I mean, I think we've kind of talked around it a little bit, but haven't specifically invoked attachment. And that's what I hear you saying in what you were trying to accomplish in that episode, is that there's an important role in accepting the impermanence in life and not becoming attached to any one aspect of it. You live in the moment, you got to live in the moment. That's great. That's all we ever have. Perfect. But don't become so attached to what's happening in that moment that when you encounter something different in another moment, that you're verklempt. What are you going to do? And that, so you were trying to say, I think, imagine these other scenarios where things might be different than they are today. And are you still going to be able to love? Or is your love based on certain conditions that are only applicable in this moment of time? And once they change, that goes away.
Yep. That's exactly the idea.
Yeah. So where does attachment fit into all? I think I remember hearing it being associated with that third noble truth, but I don't want to be dogmatic about it.
Yeah. So attachment fits in with, it correlates closely with the notion that we tend to see permanence where there's impermanence. Life is always changing, but sometimes we fail to recognize that. So we attach, like the example you gave in a relationship, this is how they are right now, and they need to always be this way. When the nature of reality is that people change, times change, everything changes. So non-attachment is essentially the wisdom of adaptability, again, like we talked about.
Great way of saying it. Yeah.
And we do this in terms of space and time. In terms of space, we see independence where there is no independence. We see a flower without seeing the sun that that's required for the flower to be. So we see things as separate from each other without seeing the interdependence of these things with all the other things. And that's another area where we experience attachment to the thing itself, without the entire chain of events, the causes and conditions and parts. So non-attachment, I think, in terms of time, is that recognition that things are changing. And in terms of space, it's the recognition that if I love this thing, I've got to love all the things that make this thing the thing too, and all the things that make the things, right? It's just this giant complex web of interdependent parts.
Despite the limits in using words and language that we talked about earlier, there's some really good words in there: attachment, interdependence, impermanence. We talked earlier on about this idea of Maya or illusion, and how dangerous is it? I don't know if danger is even the right word, but how conducive to unnecessary suffering is it to attach to anything that is a construct and is an illusion, especially when you know that things are going to change. Mm-hmm. And so much of the culture that we live in does perpetuate this illusion of separation. You don't see that the flower and the bee and the sun and the soil and the water and all of these things are all part of one large ecosystem.
Yeah.
And almost to the point where you could think of it as a large organism. Yeah. And that we are a part of that. I think humans have this tendency to really separate ourselves from the rest of life. Even to the point I had this thought a couple months ago. I was thinking about death and our rituals around death. And I imagine that once upon a time, I was reading the book Sapiens, which Nick recommended to me, by the way, and thinking about at some point when we started telling these religious fictions that we've inherited through the years, we started thinking of ourselves as being separate so that we could kind of justify our exploitation of nature, possibly as a motivation there. And instead of giving back what we're taking, we kind of hoard. And I was thinking about this in the way that we put ourselves in coffins when we did, instead of allowing our body to go back to the earth and to fertilize, and be part of that element of nature that's giving back what we've taken. We put ourselves in this box and like do these embalming things. Like we're so attached to this form that we can't even stomach the thought of death taking that away from us. We're going to preserve that for as long as we can. And to me, that became a very visceral example of this illusion, this illusory world, and the futility of really trying to maintain this form that is an impermanent form, and just how ingrained that is in so many different areas in life and so many different areas in our culture. Anyway, I thought that I had coffins.
I like that.
Cool. Well, let's wrap it up. Just talking about your book a little bit and where people can go to get it. Do you have an audio version of it, or is it just in print right now?
An audio version is in the works. I'm not sure what the time frame is on it.
Are you doing it? It's your voice?
I don't know. I offered the publisher. I told them,
is that out of your control?
Yeah, it's out of my control.
Oh, that stinks.
I wanted to record it and launch it at the same time as the paperback, and they just said, we'll tell you if and when. So I've put the feelers out on multiple occasions saying, I've got the equipment, I'll record it, I'll just send you the MP3s whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I've got a podcast. I sit and I talk all the time. I can do that with my book.
Yep, they said, hold off.
Geez. Yeah. Okay. But where's the best place for people to get it?
I think Amazon is the easiest place to find it. And I have links to that on everydaybuddhism.com. That'll take them to the Amazon page.
So that's your website, everydaybuddhism.com?
That's just the forwarding URL I used for the book because it was easy to remember.
Oh, okay.
My website's secularbuddhism.com.
Okay.
And that also has a link to the book. There's like a pop-up and it'll take you to the book.
Cool. All right. Has it been selling well? Would it come out in May?
Yep. I think May 15th.
Yeah.
Yeah. The book's been doing really well. The publisher's been really happy. And they already want me to start the next one, which I'm starting actually in a couple of weeks.
Cool.
It'll be a 5-minute mindfulness journal. So it's a little bit more of actual exercises and practices for the practicing part of mindfulness.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to talk when that one comes out again too.
Yeah.
And hopefully more in between then, because it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, Noah.
Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me to be on your podcast and talking about all this.
Now then, Buddhism. In order to introduce Buddhism, it's necessary to remember the whole background of the world view of India, the cosmology of the Hindus. Well, now, how does the Hindu see the world? The Hindu view sees it as a drama. And it's simply this: there is what there is, and always was and always will be, which is called the self. That in Sanskrit is Atman, A-T-M-A-N. And the Atman is also called Brahman. The self, according to the Hindu view, plays hide and seek with itself for always and always and always. How far out, how lost can you get? So here each one of us, according to the Hindu idea, is the Godhead on purpose, getting lost for the fun of it. And how terrible it can get at times. But won't it be nice when you wake up? Buddhism, unlike Judaism and unlike Christianity, is not very, very frantically concerned with being good.
Good.
It is concerned with being wise.
Wise.
It is concerned with being compassionate.
Compassionate.
It's a little different from being good. With having tremendous sympathy and understanding and respect for all the ignorant people who don't know that they're it, but who are playing the very far-out game of being you and I. There is this additional idea that when the self pretends that it's each of us, it reincarnates through a whole series of bodies, life after life after life, according to what is called karma. Karma, it literally means doing, the law of doing, whereby acts occur in a series and they are linked with each other in an unbreakable chain. So everybody's karma is the life course that he will work out through maybe innumerable lifetimes. I'm not going into that because a lot of Buddhists don't believe that. You will find that the Zen people, for example, are quite divided on this. They will say, no, we don't believe literally in reincarnation, that after your funeral, you will suddenly become somebody different, living somewhere else. They will say reincarnation means this, that if you sitting here now are really convinced that you're the same person who walked in at the door half an hour ago, you're being reincarnated. If you're liberated, you'll understand that you're not. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. There is only the present. And that's the only real you that there is. The word Buddha is a title, not a proper name. It means the one who is awakened, from the root in Sanskrit Buddh, B-U-D-H, to know. The man who woke up, who discovered who he really was. Now, the crucial point wherein Buddhism differs from Hinduism is it doesn't say who you are. It has no idea, no concept. And I emphasize the word idea and concept. It has no idea and no concept of God, because Buddhism is not interested in concepts. It's interested in direct experience, and direct experience only. So from the Buddhist standpoint, all concepts are wrong. Just in the same way that nothing is really what you say it is. You're only really there when you let go of everything, and you don't depend on any fixed idea, any belief for your sanity or happiness. There's nothing you can hold on to, so man, let go. Because there's no one to hold on to anything anyway. So Buddhism is the discipline of doing that. You discover something much better than anybody has who has a belief, because you got the real thing. Every teacher of Buddhism is a debunker. But he does it not to be a smart aleck and to show how clever he is, but out of compassion. Just as when a surgeon chops off a bad growth or a dentist pulls out a rotten tooth, so the Buddhist guru or surgeon is getting rid of your crazy ideas for you, which you use to cling on to life and make it dead. It's absolutely fundamental to an understanding of Buddhism to recognize that its whole method of teaching is dialectic. And since Buddhism is a dialogue, what you ordinarily understand as the teachings of Buddhism are not the teachings of Buddhism. They are simply the opening gambit or the opening process of this dialogue. The point being that Buddhism is not a teaching. Its essence consists in a certain kind of experience, in a transformation of consciousness which is called awakening or enlightenment, which involves our seeing through or transcending the hoax of being a separate ego. As I said, it is in the essence of Buddhism to be a developing process because it is a dialogue. You can see the initial steps of the dialogue in our earliest or presumed earliest records of Buddhism, in the Four Noble Truths, where you have it put out that the problem which Buddhism faces is suffering. This word dukkha, which we translate suffering, is the opposite of sukha. Sukha means what is sweet and delightful. Dukkha means the opposite, what is bitter. You could call it chronic frustration. There are three signs of being. The first is dukkha itself. The second is anitya. Nitya means permanent. Anitya means impermanent. Every manifestation of life is impermanent. And therefore, our quest to make things permanent, to straighten everything out, to get it fixed, is an impossible and insoluble problem. And therefore, we experience dukkha, or this sense of fundamental pain and frustration, as a result of trying to make things permanent. The third sign of being is called anatman. The word atman means self. Anatman means non-self. That there is in you no real ego. It has no physical reality. The ego is your symbol of yourself. The second of the Four Noble Truths is desire, clinging. This is the same thing as holding on to yourself so tightly that you strangle yourself. The cause of dukkha is clinging. If you don't recognize that this whole world is an amazing illusion, a weaving of smoke, and you try to hold on to it, you see, then you start suffering, seriously suffering. The third noble truth is called nirvana. This word means blow out. In breathing, you know that breath is life. If you hold your breath, you lose it. Let it go, because it'll come back to you. But if you don't let it go, you'll just suffocate. Don't cling, and then you're in the state of nirvana. Now then, the fourth noble truth, path. The way of Buddhism is often called the Noble Eightfold Path. In Buddhism, it is taught that everything in this universe depends on everything else. That we have a kind of a huge network, and this is called the doctrine of mutual interdependence. All of it hangs on you, and you hang on all of it. So the first phase has to do with one's understanding of the world. The second phase has to do with action, how you act. Buddhist idea of ethics is based on expediency. If you are engaged in the way of liberation and you want to clarify your consciousness, doing that is inconsistent with certain kinds of action. So every Buddhist makes 5 vows, 5 precepts, and they take the 3 refuges. The refuges are the Buddha, the Dharma, the doctrine, and the Sangha, the fellowship of all those who are on the way. So they take these 5 precepts: to abstain from taking life, to abstain from taking what is not given, to abstain from exploiting the passion, to abstain from falsifying speech, to abstain from being intoxicated. It's a purely kind of practical approach to morals. That's the second phase of the Eightfold Path. Then the third phase has to do with what we would ordinarily call meditation, recollection. The word recollect is to gather together what has been scattered. The world is regarded as the dismemberment of the self, the Brahman, the Godhead. So remembrance is realizing again that each single member of the many is really the one. So that's recollection. To be recollected is to be completely here and now, is to be completely alert, available for the present, because that's the only place that you are ever going to be in. You will find, if you thoroughly investigate the process of experiencing, that the experiencing is the same as the experiencer. So you, as someone who is aware, and all that you are aware of is one process. And you get to that state by the practice of meditation, which is sitting down quietly and being aware of all that goes on without comment, without thinking about it. And when you stop categorizing, verbalizing, talking to yourself inside your head, naturally the separations between, for example, knower and known, self and other, simply vanish. If you go through this and you get completely blown out and released and are in the state of nirvana, when you get to this state of nirvana, there wells up from within you compassion. The sense that you aren't different from everybody else. Everybody else's suffering is your suffering. So that he who reaches nirvana doesn't, as it were, withdraw into a sort of isolated peace, but is always coming back into the world, into the difficulties, into the problems of life, in compassion for everyone else. You can't be saved alone, because you're not alone.
Hei, dette Claudia i Mwelv i Norge. Did you know that infants on thrones in Norwegian are called spedbarn på troner? Du kan kommentere denne episoden på nettsiden infantsonthrones.com. Og hvis du liker det du hører, gi forumet 5 stjerner og skriv en kort anmeldelse på iTunes. Det har jeg gjort. For all you non-Norwegian speakers out there, you can comment on this episode on infantsonthrones.com. And if you really like what you hear, give the quorum a 5-star rating in iTunes.
And if you really, 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 really like what you hear and you want to make sure that we keep continuing to do it and incentivize us to do it, Patreon, man. Patreon. For as little as $1 per episode up to whatever monthly budget you want to cap that whole thing at. Patreon, where you will get exclusive content not available to non-Patreon subscribers. And you'll keep this podcast going. And do you know how to say come and join us on Patreon in Norwegian? Neither do I, but it doesn't matter. Just do it in English. Thanks.
Det noen som avslutter med bønn?
Thank you for listening to Infants on Thrones.